There's a moment in 1961 that tells you everything you need to know about Arnie Beswick. It's June at Indianapolis Raceway Park, and the NHRA U.S. Nationals are in full swing, and parked in the staging lanes is the most fearsome car Pontiac has ever built, the Super Duty 421 Catalina driven by Mickey Thompson, who at this point is maybe the most famous speed merchant in America. A guy who set the land speed record at Bonneville, and has factory backing and a team behind him, and basically every resource Pontiac can quietly funnel to a racer without officially admitting they're involved in racing at all. And who shows up to beat him? A farmer from Morrison, Illinois, who grew up on a case tractor and still has to get home to tend the land when the race weekend is over. Arnie Beswick took that super stock class win, and when the officials tore down his car afterward, they called him overbore on one cylinder by 1/1000th of an inch, not even close enough to matter under normal measuring conditions. But the engine was still hot from the run, which throws the readings off, and they disqualified him anyway. And the thing that makes this story is that Beswick wasn't bitter about losing the trophy. What stayed with him was the fact that he'd beaten Mickey Thompson fair and square in the heat of competition, and nobody could take that run away from him regardless of what a rule book said. That's Arnie Beswick, the guy who beat the factory cars while being an independent, the guy who kept Pontiac alive on the drag strip after General Motors told everyone to go home, the farmer who became the most important Pontiac racer in American drag history. And the one who proves that sometimes the most interesting story isn't the factory hero, it's the guy out there alone who just refused to quit. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the unsung heroes of American drag racing history. If you're someone who gets genuinely fired up about the golden age of factory muscle, the match race era, and the guys who built legends 1/4 mile at a time without a corporation writing their checks, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. So let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what Beswick pulled off, you got to understand where Pontiac was in 1958 and why it almost didn't exist at all. Pontiac in the mid-1950s was in serious trouble. Not struggling a little. We're talking about a division that General Motors executives were actively considering shutting down or merging with Oldsmobile. Sales were sliding, the cars were seen as boring. The brand was what you bought when you were too old for a Chevy, but not quite ready for a Buick, and that image was killing it at the dealership. Something had to change dramatically, or Pontiac was going to quietly disappear. GM brought in a guy named Seaman Knudsen in July 1956 to fix it. Everyone called him Bunky. He was 44 years old, and he'd grown up in the auto industry. His father was an executive too, and he understood intuitively that performance sells cars, even to people who will never see a racetrack. You put a fast car in the public eye, and people who just want to drive to the grocery store start associating your brand with speed. And that association is worth more than any ad campaign you can buy. So Bunky came in and immediately started hiring the right people and pointing them in the right direction. He brought in Pete Estes from Oldsmobile as chief engineer. He got John DeLorean from the dying Studebaker Packard operation into the advanced engineering side. He had an engine wizard named Malcolm McKellar, who'd been at Pontiac since before World War II, and understood internal combustion at a level most engineers just didn't. And he had a freelance ad guy named Jim Wongers, who didn't technically work for GM at all, an arrangement that was probably intentional, because Wongers was going to do things that would have gotten a GM employee fired, and everybody knew it. The thing Bunky understood was that the AMA resolution of 1957, the agreement where the manufacturers were supposed to stop promoting speed and supporting racing after a bunch of high-profile crashes, was a polite suggestion, not a law. And Pontiac was going to ignore it as aggressively as they could while maintaining plausible deniability. The key mechanism was the dealer parts counter. If you sold a performance part as a dealer-available component with a regular factory part number, then technically it was just a consumer product and had nothing to do with racing. This is the world Arnie Beswick walked into in 1958 when he bought his first Pontiac. Arnie Beswick was born May 7, 1930 on a farm a few miles west of Morrison, Illinois. Whiteside County. Third-generation farming family. His father, Raymond, had a childhood injury that limited what he could do physically, so Arnie and his mother took on the heavy work. By age 10 or 11, he was driving the family's orange case tractor, doing field work and hauling manure and plowing and all the other unglamorous things that come with farming in northern Illinois. His dad would coach him through mechanical repairs verbally. This bolt has to come out and then this one. And Beswick says that's where the mechanical intuition came from. The hands-on problem-solving that farm equipment demands every single day. He graduated from Morrison High School in 1948 and went through a sequence of cars that probably sounds familiar to anyone who grew up in that era. A black 1936 Chevrolet. His parents' 1937 Plymouth that all his friends wanted to ride in. And then a 1950 Oldsmobile Rocket 88 that he bought with his own money and which changed everything. The Rocket 88 was the hot car of the early 1950s. The overhead valve V8 in a reasonably light body was a combination that produced genuine performance by the standards of the day. And young guys all over America were discovering what it could do. Beswick was no different. He was running Route 30 from Morrison to Fulton, Route 78 into Carroll County, Route 88, south of Rock Falls, basically anywhere you could find a straight piece of road and a willing opponent. He joined the Mississippi Modifieds Auto Club, and in 1951, he drove that Olds 88 to Half-Day, Illinois, an abandoned airstrip-turned-drag strip, and won his class in his first organized race. He was 20 years old. And here's the thing about Beswick, even at that early stage, he wasn't just a guy who had a fast car. He was a guy who understood how to make cars go faster and who was willing to do the work. That combination of mechanical ability and competitive drive is what separated the guys who showed up from the guys who actually mattered. He won at the first World Series of drag racing at Lawrenceville in 1954. He won at the very first NHRA Nationals at Great Bend, Kansas in 1955. He was doing all of this in Oldsmobiles and then a couple of Dodges with their early Hemi engines and getting seriously good at the game. And then he drove a 1957 Pontiac. He was helping a friend with the car, and when he felt what the engine had, the torque curve, the throttle response, the way it pulled through the gears, he decided this was what he wanted. In 1958, he walked into a dealership and bought a Chieftain equipped with the top engine option Pontiac offered that year. And his relationship with the Pontiac Motor Company began in earnest. He would never drive anything else competitively for the rest of his career. Now, here's something the documentary title gets slightly sideways, and it matters for accuracy. The wide track thing that everyone associates with 1958 Pontiacs is actually a 1959 innovation. Pete Estes widened the front and rear track by about 5 inches for the 1959 model year, and copywriter Mild Coulson came up with the wide track tagline. The 1958 cars are on the older chassis. Great cars, but the wide track marketing hadn't arrived yet. What the 1958 Pontiac did have was the best engine Pontiac made up to that point. The 370 cubic inch V8, actual displacement was 369.4 cubic inches if you want to be precise, topped out with the Tempest 395A tri-power package, 3 Rochester 2-barrel carburetors on a progressive linkage. So at part throttle, you're only running the center carb for fuel economy, and when you floor it, all 3 open up and the engine gets everything it can swallow. Solid lifter camshaft, dual exhaust, 10.5 to 1 compression ratio, 330 horsepower at 5,200 revolutions per minute, and 415 pound-feet of torque. For 1958, that was genuinely formidable. The problem was the transmission. You got a 3-speed column shift as standard, and the automatic was the only real alternative, and neither was ideal for drag racing. But Beswick made it work because he understood how to drive what he had, and because the engine itself was so strong that it compensated for the drivetrain limitations. His 1958 Chieftain was specifically chosen because it was the lightest body in the Pontiac lineup. Shorter wheelbase than the Star Chief or Super Chief, less trim, less sound deadening, less of everything that added weight without adding speed. He deleted the heater and the radio and ordered the steepest rear axle ratio he could get, and drove to the track. The car was a consistent winner with minimal maintenance, and it established the formula Beswick would use for the next few years. Lightest possible body on the hottest possible engine with every luxury item deleted. What it also did was get him connected to the Pontiac performance world at exactly the right moment. Now, you might be thinking, look, lots of guys were doing this kind of thing in the late 1950s. Stripping out cars, finding the lightest body, hunting down the hottest engine option. And you'd be right, that part wasn't unique to Beswick. What was unique was the combination of his mechanical instincts, his competitive consistency, and the timing of when he arrived in the Pontiac ecosystem. Because 1959 and 1960 changed everything for Pontiac drag racing. The Super Duty Parts program kicked into gear, and the stuff McKellar's team was developing was extraordinary for the era. Forged steel crankshafts, forged connecting rods, high-flow cylinder heads with massive ports, solid lifter camshaft profiles, the McKellar cams they were called, that unlocked power the stock heads couldn't support anyway. Cast aluminum intake manifolds, heavy-duty everything. Here's what most people don't realize about how this program actually worked in practice. Pontiac couldn't officially sell these parts as racing components without violating the AMA resolution that GM had publicly signed. So they listed them in the dealer parts catalog with regular part numbers, priced them like any other service component, and trusted that the people who needed to know would figure it out. This is the automotive equivalent of a speakeasy where the door is unlocked and there's a neon sign in the window, but technically nobody's doing anything wrong. For 1960, Beswick managed to get his hands on something very special. He ordered a 1960 Ventura, that's the sport trim package on the Catalina body, with the Super Duty 389 engine package, factory rated at 348 horsepower. But that number was conservative in the way that all factory performance ratings in this era were conservative. The engine made considerably more than that in reality. What makes this car historically interesting is that Beswick apparently received a set of Super Duty heads and a camshaft shipped separately in the trunk of the car, a covert delivery method that Pontiac used to funnel racing parts to favored customers without it showing up obviously in the factory build sheet. With those parts installed, the output jumped to around 363 horsepower. He drove it straight from Morrison to Daytona Beach with the window sticker still on the glass and won the Super Stock Award at the NHRA and NASCAR Winter Nationals. When another competitor protested, claiming the car couldn't be legal if it was winning by that margin, Pontiac had to wire the build sheet down to Florida to prove the car was exactly what it was supposed to be. It was. Beswick was clean. The protest went nowhere and he drove home with the trophy. And here's a detail that gets footnoted in the history but deserves more attention. The 1960 Ventura is believed to have been the first Pontiac ever delivered from the factory with a floor-shift 4-speed manual transmission. The very first one. Pontiac was just starting to offer that configuration and Beswick apparently got the first example. That's a pretty remarkable footnote for a farmer from Morrison, Illinois. He came back the following year and won again. The 1961 season is where the legend really solidified. At Daytona Speed Weeks, he won his class and then went on to take the overall Super Stock Eliminator title. And then immediately after, while he was still in the region and still in peak competitive form, a match race was arranged against the Royal Pontiac team from Royal Oak, Michigan. You got to understand what Royal Pontiac meant in this context. Ace Wilson's dealership had become the de facto official Pontiac performance headquarters. Mechanic Milt Shornack tuned their cars to a level the factory couldn't officially acknowledge. Jim Wongers had set the whole operation up specifically to give Pontiac a racing presence that maintained deniability from corporate headquarters. These were the factory-backed guys. This was the establishment. And Beswick was an independent with no sponsorship and no factory support, going up against 3 of them in a best-of-5. He beat them 3 straight. Not close. Didn't need the other 2 races. The significance of this is hard to overstate if you know the politics of the era. The Royal Pontiac team represented everything the factory wanted drag racing to look like: professional, well-funded, polished. And a guy who farmed for a living beat them convincingly using a car he'd prepared himself on a farm in northern Illinois. The match race circuit talked about it for months. Promoters started booking Beswick specifically because he was the independent who beat the factory men. Then came Indianapolis and the Mickey Thompson race, and the 1,000th of an inch disqualification and the controversial teardown. Beswick went home without the official trophy, but with a reputation that only gets more interesting with every year that passes. What Pontiac was building toward in 1961 and 1962 was something that had no real precedent in American automotive history. The Super Duty 421 engine, that debuted in 1961, was a legitimate race engine sold, in theory, through the dealer parts counter. 4¼ inches of bore, 4 even inches of stroke, 421 cubic inches of displacement, 3¼ inch main journals with 4-bolt main cap. Mickey Thompson forged aluminum pistons, dual Carter AFB 4-barrels on an aluminum intake, cast iron exhaust manifolds with removable end caps specifically designed to bolt onto dragstrip headers. The factory rated it at 405 horsepower. Motor Trend testing found closer to 460 in real-world conditions. A Chevrolet internal memo from September 1962, and the competition was apparently paying close attention, listed Pontiac's 421 at 468 horsepower at 5,800 revolutions per minute. So whatever the window sticker said, it was making somewhere north of 460 ponies in a car that could be ordered at a Pontiac dealership. This is where it gets really interesting, because the way Pontiac structured the Super Duty program meant that technically none of this was racing involvement. It was just a very enthusiastic parts catalog. The lawyers at GM apparently found this arrangement acceptable, at least for a while, and that window of acceptability is what allowed Beswick and the other Super Duty runners to operate with a kind of quiet factory blessing that never got officially acknowledged. For the 1962 season, Beswick ordered what he called the Passionate Poncho, a Super Duty 421 Catalina. The car was ensign blue metallic with a blue and white interior, and it absolutely did not look like a race car from the outside. No stripe, no number. The sort of car you might see in a grocery store parking lot. That was part of the strategy. Arrive at the track looking like nothing special and then go out and run times that nobody could match. He won stock eliminator at the Daytona Winter Nationals with it. He was dominant on the match race circuit. The combination of the car's performance and his own accumulated skill and reputation was producing results that made promoters fight to get him on the schedule. Think about that for a second. Here's a guy running out of a farm in Illinois with no publicist, no marketing team, no corporate backing, and track promoters across the country are competing to book him because crowds will show up specifically to watch him race. That's not just a fast car. That's a personality, a story, a brand built entirely on performance and reputation over more than a decade of consistent winning. But behind the scenes, something was building that was going to change all of this. General Motors Corporate was watching the escalation of factory involvement in drag racing, not just by Pontiac but by Chevrolet and their Z11 Impala 427 program, and the lawyers and executives were getting nervous. The AMA resolution said manufacturers weren't supposed to be doing this. GM was doing it very obviously. And in January 1963, Chairman Frederick Donner lowered the boom. The internal GM memo that came down on January 24, 1963 was unambiguous. All divisions were ordered to cease racing activities immediately. Mac McKellar himself confirmed years later that the directive stated anyone caught violating the policy would be terminated without question. This was not a suggestion. This was a corporate order from the top of the most powerful automotive company in the world. Pontiac had to stop. Everything stopped. The Super Duty program that McKellar and his team had spent years developing was killed overnight. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the factory pulled out and Beswick just had to find another manufacturer to work with, right? That's not what happened. That's not even close to what happened. Beswick didn't go find another manufacturer. He didn't switch to Ford when the total performance money was flowing. He didn't call up Chrysler when the 426 Hemi was rewriting the record book. He stayed with Pontiac. Without the factory. Without the support. Without the parts pipeline. Without any of it. And he kept winning. Here's what most people don't realize about what that actually meant in practical terms. When the Super Duty program ended, the development of Pontiac racing parts essentially froze. McKellar's team couldn't build new stuff. The dealer parts catalog stopped expanding on the performance side. The covert shipments in the trunks of cars, the specially prepared heads, the race cams, all of it stopped. And simultaneously, Ford was pouring resources into drag racing at a level that made Pontiac's Super Duty budget look like lunch money. The Thunderbolt program alone represented an investment that no independent could match. Chrysler had the 426 Max Wedge and was already developing what would become the 426 Hemi. These were factory-backed efforts with engineering teams and unlimited development budgets pointed directly at the drag strip. And there's Beswick showing up to drag strips with his remaining Super Duty Pontiac hardware facing fully factory-backed Ford and Mopar teams who had engineering support and unlimited development budgets while he was operating out of a farm in Illinois. Track promoters loved this. They were desperate to book him specifically because of it. The fact that he was the lone GM representative made every race he entered into a David versus Goliath narrative, and crowds responded to that in a way they never would to another well-funded factory team running predictable equipment. When Arnie Beswick showed up, you were watching a real underdog race, and he kept winning. Look, the match race economy of the early 1960s worked on a simple principle. You needed a story that got people through the gate. Two factory teams running the same equipment in the same class doesn't have a story. But an independent farmer from Illinois showing up in a plain blue Catalina to take on the best Ford and Mopar could bring? That's a story. That's something worth driving 45 minutes on a Saturday night to watch. At the 1964 Daytona event, a week-long meet, he was the only Pontiac in a field dominated by Ford Thunderbolts and Mopar Hemis. Ford Motor Company protested his car. NASCAR officials tore it down and inspected every inch of it and declared it completely legal. Beswick won the overall championship for the week. He captured the Drag News #1 Mr. Stock Eliminator title that year, which was the most prestigious ranking in the country for what he was doing. None of that happened with factory support. None of it. And here's the thing that really puts it in perspective. According to historian Martin Shore, who covered the match race era extensively, independent operators like Beswick were typically working on budgets that represented maybe 10 to 15% of what a factory-backed effort could spend in the same period. 10 to 15%. And Beswick was not just competing, he was winning championships and setting attendance records at tracks across the country. The mechanical foundation that made this possible was the inventory of Super Duty hardware he'd accumulated before the ban hit. By January 1963, he had enough parts and enough knowledge of how to make those parts work together that he could continue developing his cars without needing anything new from Pontiac's engineering department. He understood the Super Duty 421 at a level that very few people outside of McKellar's own team could match, and he applied that understanding with the same systematic problem-solving approach he'd learned maintaining farm equipment in Whiteside County. Every failure was data. Every successful run was confirmation of a theory. The approach never changed from the days of the 1950 Olds 88 on Route 30. Figure out what the car needs, give it what it needs, and go see what happens. Now think about what was happening at Pontiac while Beswick was out there keeping the brand visible without any corporate help. The engineers who'd been building race engines had to do something with their knowledge after the ban. They couldn't build Super Duty parts anymore, but they could build streetcars. And in early 1963, a Pontiac engineer named Bill Collins made a casual observation at Milford Proving Ground. It would take about 20 minutes to stuff the full-size 389 engine into the new intermediate Tempest body, which was going to debut as a 1964 model with a 326 cubic inch engine. Another engineer named Russ G. said, "Let's try it." DeLorean said fine. Within a week they had a running prototype, and it was extraordinary. A full-size performance engine in a car that weighed considerably less than the full-size Pontiac. They called it the GTO, sold it as a $295.90 option package on the Tempest Lemons to get around GM's corporate prohibition on engines over 330 cubic inches in intermediate cars, and planned to sell 5,000 of them. They sold 32,450 in the first year. 96,000 and change in 1966. Jim Wongers arranged for a ringer, a GTO secretly equipped with a Super Duty 421 instead of the advertised 389, to be tested by Car and Driver magazine for their March 1964 issue, and the resulting article called it the fastest car in America. Car and Driver writer Brock Yates used the phrase muscle car to describe it, and that term attached itself to an entire generation of American performance vehicles. Here's what most people don't realize about the connection between that GTO launch and what Beswick was doing simultaneously on the match race circuit. The GTO succeeded partly because Pontiac still had a performance reputation when it launched. If the brand had gone completely quiet after January 1963, no racing presence, no competitive cars visible to the public, that reputation evaporates fast. Consumers have short memories when there's nothing reinforcing the image. Beswick was the living proof that Pontiac built fast cars even when the corporation was pretending it didn't care about fast cars. Every time he lined up against a Ford Thunderbolt and won, every time he packed a grandstand in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Indiana, he was doing Pontiac's marketing for them without a contract, without a check, without even a phone call from anyone in Warren, Michigan thanking him for the effort. He was just out there because he believed in the cars and because winning was what he did. Beswick's 1964 GTO was the only example known to have left the factory with an aluminum front end. He used it as the foundation for his next phase of racing, and on April 17, 1965 at US 30 Dragway in York, Pennsylvania, he ran 9.97 seconds in the quarter mile in a stock-bodied car. The first sub-10-second quarter mile in a production-bodied car in the history of the sport. Let that sink in for a moment. Not just fast. Not just competitive. The first human being to run a stock-bodied car through the quarter mile in under 10 seconds. That milestone belongs to a farmer from Morrison, Illinois, with no factory backing, running on a budget that Ford's racing department would have considered rounding error. He later became the first person to crack into the 8-second bracket in a stock-bodied car as well. These are milestones that belong in any serious accounting of drag racing history, and they were achieved by an independent running on determination and mechanical knowledge and sheer refusal to accept that the guys with more money should automatically go faster. This is where it gets really interesting because the funny car era that was starting to build in the mid-1960s suited Beswick's personality completely. The class structure that NHRA and other sanctioning bodies provided was giving way to a match race culture where what mattered was spectacle and personality and performance. And the funny cars, stock-bodied in appearance but with altered wheelbases and fiberglass bodies and supercharged nitromethane engines, were the perfect vehicle for everything Beswick had become. He built the Tameless Tiger from a 1963 Tempest. The wheelbase was moved forward nearly a foot, about 10 to 12 inches depending on the source, to help with weight transfer on launch. The Tiger-striped paint job in orange and black was impossible to miss. Supercharged nitromethane. It ran wheel stands to half-track on most passes. Not because Beswick was trying to do a show, though the crowd loved it, but because the car had so much torque and the wheelbase geometry pushed the weight rearward so aggressively that the front end just came up every single pass. He described those wheel stands as the most terrifying thing imaginable from behind the wheel. You could see nothing but sky, and you had no idea whether the car was going straight until the wheels came down. That was just part of running the Tameless Tiger. And here's the thing about that car that gets lost when people focus on the spectacle of the wheel stands. The Tameless Tiger wasn't built for show. It was built to win. The showmanship was a byproduct of the engineering decisions Beswick made to extract maximum performance from the combination of a supercharged nitro engine and a lightweight altered wheelbase body. The fact that it looked like the most dramatic thing anyone had ever seen at a drag strip was almost incidental. Almost. Because Beswick also understood that the match race economy rewarded spectacle as well as speed. A car that ran fast but looked boring didn't book as many dates as a car that ran fast and lifted its front wheels to the clouds on every single pass. The Tameless Tiger did both, and the booking calendar reflected it. The rivalry with Mr. Norm's Grand Spalding Dodge was something special that deserves its own discussion. When Beswick's GTO and Mr. Norm's supercharged nitro-burning Dodge went at it, the theater was complete. At Oswego Dragway, someone arranged for a small airplane to fly over before the event, dropping 50,000 leaflets that read "Go Go Dodge, beat that factory-backed GTO." The irony being that Beswick was absolutely not factory-backed, but the narrative worked. The match was promoted on WLS in Chicago, a 50,000-watt clear channel station that reached half the country at night, and the track was packed. That's what Beswick had become. Not just a fast car. A story, an event, a reason to drive to the track on a Saturday night. He kept building cars through the late 1960s. The all-fiberglass 1966 GTO, called the star of the circuit. A flip-top 1968 GTO. The Logie-built 1969 GTO Judge, called the Super Judge. The 1971 Firebird Bossbird. Each car was faster and more extreme than the last, and his reputation kept him booked solid on the match race circuit week after week. Now, you might be thinking, look, this sounds like a pretty good operation. Winning races, packing tracks, building increasingly wild cars. What's the catch? And here's the thing that the highlight reel version of this story always leaves out. Think about the physical demands of what he was doing. Some seasons he ran 4 or 5 different tracks in a single week. You're loading the car and the spare parts and driving to the next town and unloading everything and making passes and reloading and driving again. No team, no corporate infrastructure, him and whoever he could round up to help, farming during the week and racing on weekends and trying to keep both operations running simultaneously. His wife Evelyn worked at General Electric in Morrison for over 35 years. She raised 4 daughters essentially as a single parent during racing season. That's the part of the story that tends to get left out of the highlight reel. The unglamorous family economics of running an independent racing operation out of an Illinois farm, while the factories had budgets that made real money look like pocket change. The match race circuit of the late 1960s was reaching a kind of peak intensity that was simultaneously its greatest moment and the beginning of its end. NHRA was formalizing the funny car class within its own structure, which meant the Wild West of the independent booking circuit was slowly getting absorbed into a more organized competitive framework. Some of the guys who'd been running the circuit found that transition natural. Others found that the formalized class structure didn't suit the kind of operation they'd been running. Beswick was in the latter category. His whole approach was built around the match race format, the direct challenge, the head-to-head competition, the story that got people through the gate. The formalized class structure was a different animal, and the economics of running within it were different too. But before any of that transition could fully play out, something happened in April 1972 that changed everything. In April of that year, a fire broke out in the shop on the farm. When it was over, everything was gone. Every engine, every race car, every tool, every spare part, the race hauler, most of the farm machinery, everything he had built and accumulated over more than 2 decades of racing was ash. No factory backing to replace it, no sponsorship to call on, no insurance on the race equipment, just gone. Beswick later described it as devastating beyond anything he had words for. He spent the next decade rebuilding the farm. Just the farm. Racing wasn't possible financially and emotionally after losing that much, and he stepped away from competition while he put the pieces back together. He was gone from the sport for over a decade, but the fans didn't forget. The match race era was winding down through the 1970s as the funny car class within NHRA became more formalized and the independent booking circuit that had sustained guys like Beswick started to fragment. But the guys who'd been there, who remembered the Tameless Tiger doing wheelstands to half-track, and Beswick beating the factory teams at Daytona with no support, they kept talking about it. The letters and calls found their way to Morrison. People wanted him back. And here's the thing about that kind of reputation. It doesn't get built by a marketing department. It doesn't get manufactured by a PR firm. It gets built pass by pass and track by track over decades of showing up and delivering and never making excuses when things go wrong. Beswick had spent 20-plus years building exactly that kind of reputation, and it turned out that reputation was the one thing the 1972 fire couldn't touch. In 1986, he returned to nostalgia racing, built a new Tameless Tiger recreation running over 1,200 horsepower and going into the low sevens at over 190 miles per hour. Not the same car as 1965, he's clear about that in interviews, but the same spirit and the same driver and the same orange and black Tiger stripe paint job that crowds had been seeing at drag strips for 20 years. He was 56 years old when he came back, and he was running the quarter-mile faster than he ever had in his life. Think about that for a second. Most racers at 56 are retired or running at a fraction of their former pace. Beswick came back after 14 years away from competition and immediately started setting personal bests. The combination of improved tire technology, better fuel systems, and the accumulated knowledge of someone who'd been thinking about how to make Pontiacs go fast for his entire adult life produced results that would have been impossible in the original funny car era. The nostalgia racing scene that was developing in the mid-1980s was exactly the right environment for what Beswick represented. Fans who'd grown up watching the match race era in the 1960s were now in their 30s and 40s and had disposable income and genuine nostalgia for the cars and drivers they'd idolized as kids. Promoters understood that booking a guy like Beswick wasn't just booking a fast car. It was booking a piece of living history that the audience had an emotional connection to. The economics worked in a way they hadn't during the original match race era because now the nostalgia itself was the product and Beswick had more of it than almost anyone still active in the sport. He ran the nostalgia circuit through the late 1980s and 1990s with a consistency that mirrored his original career. Show up, go fast, give the crowd something to talk about on the drive home. The cars kept getting updated, the horsepower numbers kept climbing, but the fundamental approach never changed. Here's what most people don't realize about the nostalgia racing economy and why it mattered for guys like Beswick specifically. The original match race circuit had been driven by the novelty of the cars and the personalities behind them. Nobody had seen a supercharged nitromethane funny car with an altered wheelbase doing wheelstands in 1965. It was genuinely new and startling, and the crowds reflected that novelty. By the 1980s and 1990s, the novelty had shifted. What was new was the opportunity to see the original cars and drivers again, or at least faithful recreations of them. The Tameless Tiger in orange and black tiger stripes wasn't novel in the same way the original had been, but it was something arguably more valuable to a specific audience. It was a direct connection to a moment in automotive history that those fans had experienced firsthand and wanted to experience again. Beswick understood this intuitively, and he delivered it with the same commitment he'd brought to every other phase of his career. He wasn't coasting on reputation. He was running competitive times in a car built to honor the original while performing at a level the original could never have reached. The community around him during this period reflects something important about what he'd built over 5 decades. When Beswick came back in 1986, he wasn't starting from scratch socially. The network of mechanics, part suppliers, fellow racers, and fans that he'd developed during the original match race era was still largely intact and still interested in what he was doing. The drag racing community has a long memory for the people who contributed to it genuinely, and Beswick's contributions were impossible to overstate. The guys who'd watched him beat the factory teams in 1964 and 1965 were still around and still talking about it and still showing up when his name was on the program. And there's something in that continuity that tells you something important about how Beswick had conducted himself throughout his career. He hadn't burned bridges. He hadn't created enemies through arrogance or sharp dealing. The competitive intensity that made him so effective on the track apparently coexisted with a personal character that left people genuinely glad to have known him. That combination is rarer than it should be in any competitive environment. The 2003 incident is the hardest part of the story to tell, and it needs to be treated with the respect it deserves. At a track near Wentzville, Missouri in August of that year, a fire engulfed his car after a pass. Beswick suffered severe burns to his face, hands, and feet. The recovery required multiple surgeries. He never fully regained the use of his hands the way they'd worked before. He was 73 years old. Let that number sit there for a moment. 73 years old, severe burns to his face and hands and feet, multiple surgeries, permanent loss of dexterity in his hands. For most people in most circumstances, that is the end of the story. The curtain comes down, the career is over, and you spend whatever time you have left in recovery and reflection. That is not what happened. He came back. Not all the way back to competition in the same way. The injuries were serious enough that full power runs became much more limited. But he came back to shows and appearances and to the community that had followed him for 5 decades. The fans showed up at the hospital. They showed up at events when he was recovered enough to attend. The connection between Arnie Beswick and the people who'd watched him race was the kind of relationship that doesn't just evaporate because the driver gets hurt. Look, there's a version of this story where the 2003 fire is the defining moment of tragedy that overshadows everything else. And I understand why someone might frame it that way. The injuries were genuinely severe, and the recovery was genuinely difficult, and the permanent effects on his hands were genuinely limiting for a man whose entire life had been built around the ability to work with his hands mechanically. But I don't think that framing does justice to what actually happened afterward. Because what happened afterward was that a 73-year-old man with burned hands and a burned face decided that the sport and the community and the cars that had defined his life for more than 50 years were worth coming back to. And he did. The recognitions came eventually, even if they were late in arriving relative to what he'd actually accomplished. 1995, Super Stock and Drag Illustrated Magazine Hall of Fame. 2006 International Drag Racing Hall of Fame at the Don Garlits Museum. 2018 Pontiac Preservation Association Hall of Fame and the inaugural class of the World Series of Drag Racing Hall of Fame at Cordova. Multiple other regional and divisional honors accumulated over the years, each one representing a piece of an establishment finally catching up to what the people who'd actually been at the tracks already knew. On November 9, 2024, Morrison, Illinois Mayor Scott Vandermeide proclaimed Arnie Beswick Day. 200 to 300 people showed up. Richard Petty sent a congratulatory letter. The town that watched a kid street racing on Route 30 in a 1950 Oldsmobile turned out to honor a 94-year-old man who spent his life proving that the underdog from the farm could beat the factory establishment. He still lives there, on the farm west of Morrison. He doesn't do the physical farming anymore. He hires that out, but the operation still produces excellent corn yields, and he still lives on the land his family has worked for 3 generations. At 95 years old, he still makes appearances, still signs autographs, still talks to fans who want to shake the hand of the guy who ran 9.97 in a stock-bodied car in 1965 and beat the factory teams without a dime of factory money behind him. Here's what I think is the most underappreciated part of his story and why it matters beyond just drag racing history. After GM's January 1963 ban killed the Super Duty program, all the factory-backed stuff stopped. Ford kept going, Chrysler kept going, GM left their racers on their own. And for most of the mid-1960s, the dominant story at the drag strip in super stock and FX class and the emerging funny car world was Ford versus Mopar, with everyone else as supporting cast. Except Beswick was still there, still booking, still winning matches, still packing the grandstands, and every time he showed up to a track against Ford Thunderbolts or Mopar Hemis, the crowd got a GM car to root for. The Pontiac name stayed alive in competitive drag racing because of one guy farming the land outside Morrison, Illinois, and refusing to accept that the factory's retreat from competition had anything to do with what he was going to do. That matters enormously for the GTO story, and it matters in a way that almost nobody talks about when they're discussing how the muscle car era actually developed. The 1964 GTO succeeded partly because Pontiac still had a performance reputation when it launched. If the brand had gone quiet after January 1963, no racing presence, no competitive cars visible to the public, that reputation evaporates fast. Consumers have short memories when there's nothing reinforcing the image week after week at tracks across the country. Beswick maintained it with no corporate support whatsoever. He was the living proof that Pontiac built fast cars even when the corporation was pretending it didn't care about fast cars. Jim Wongers understood this connection deeply. In his memoir Glory Days, he talks about the match race circuit as one of the key mechanisms for maintaining Pontiac's performance image during the corporate racing ban. Beswick isn't just a colorful figure in this story. He's structurally important to how Pontiac survived the transition from Super Duty to muscle car. Without him holding that competitive presence together through 1963 and 1964 and 1965, the cultural context that made the GTO's performance marketing believable is significantly weakened. You can't sell a car as the fastest thing on the street if nobody's been watching a car with your name on it go fast for the past 2 years. Beswick was providing that proof of concept for free, out of his own pocket, because he believed in the cars and because winning was simply what he did. Here's the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about this whole story. The Swiss cheese Catalinas that Beswick had in his inventory after the ban deserve their own discussion because these things are extraordinary pieces of automotive history. Pontiac engineers literally drilled 120 to 130 holes in the frame rails. They removed the bottom plate of the box section from the frame entirely. The frames were so compromised structurally during assembly that they had to use 2x4 lumber braces just to keep the cars from flexing out of shape during the build process. Aluminum front fenders, aluminum hood, aluminum inner fenders and radiator supporting bumpers, plexiglass windows, aluminum exhaust manifolds that weighed 27 pounds each instead of 72 pounds for the cast iron versions. All the sealer and sound deadener and insulation deleted. Race weight was around 3,300 pounds. Quarter-mile times were in the low 12-second range at 115 to 120 miles per hour. 9 of the 14 that were built are known to survive today, and when they come up at auction they bring between $430,000 and $530,000. That tells you what the collector market thinks about their historical significance. But the bigger significance for Beswick's story is that these were the last cars GM would build for him. After January 24, 1963, he was completely on his own, and he stayed anyway. The 1962 Passionate Poncho now has a 1/18 scale die-cast replica in the Legends of the Quarter Mile series. That's the kind of recognition that happens when a car and a driver have genuinely moved the culture enough that people want a physical object to connect them to the moment. It's a small thing in isolation, but it represents something larger. The market for that diecast exists because enough people care deeply enough about what Beswick accomplished that they want it on a shelf in their garage or their office. That's legacy in a very concrete form. Now, you might be thinking, look, there are a lot of great stories from the golden age of drag racing. What makes this one different? What makes Beswick specifically worth this much attention? And here's my answer. Most of the legendary names from that era had something Beswick never had. Factory backing, sponsorship money, a team, a corporation whose reputation depended on their success. The legends with those resources are genuinely impressive. But Beswick did what he did without any of it. The 9.97 quarter mile in a stock-bodied car. The first sub-8 in a stock-bodied car. The Daytona Championship against the full Ford factory effort. The match race wins against Royal Pontiac, against Mr. Norm, against Mickey Thompson. All of it accomplished by a third-generation farmer from Whiteside County, Illinois, who learned mechanical intuition on a case tractor and never stopped applying that same systematic hands-on problem-solving to every car he ever built. The 1958 Pontiac Chieftain that started all of this was just a car. A good one for its year, but not obviously the beginning of something extraordinary. What made it significant was the farmer who bought it and what he decided to do with it. That approach, which never changed in 50-plus years of competition, is the whole story. The cars got faster, the stakes got higher, the technology got wilder, the fires almost ended it twice, but the fundamental approach was always the same. Figure out what the car needs, make it as right as you can with what you have, and go line up against whoever they've got. Arnie Beswick is 95 years old and still out there. The records stand. The Tameless Tiger lives on. And somewhere on a farm outside Morrison, Illinois, the legacy of a kid who refused to be outworked or outthought or outrun is still very much alive.